Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Mariana Garcia. I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the Old State House, and I want to thank you all for coming today to the second program in our limited fall series, Untangling the Tally, a look inside the election process. The mission of the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House is to inspire and provide people with a lifetime pathway to active citizenship and the tools they need to take civic action in their own communities. But elections are the cornerstone of a healthy civic life, and that's why we created this series now on the lead up to the 2022 elections to take a deep dive into the election process and to help voters feel more empowered and prepared and confident when it's time to head to the polls this November. Today's program will focus on media and elections and what role the media and information and communications plays in elections in the lead up, during, and even after Election Day. If you have any questions during today's program, just raise your hand at the very end. I will come to you with a mic. And if you are watching online, I invite you to post all your questions on the comment section. We will see them. And we have a wonderful panel of experts here today to talk to us all things media and elections. But first, allow me to introduce to the moderator of today's program, Anita Ford Saunders. Anita Ford Saunders, APR, is a veteran of communications and public relations with over 40 years experience in the field. A seasoned writer, producer, broadcast professional, her knowledge of the media is matched only by her community involvement in over 20 civic and professional boards during her career, including the Connecticut Democracy Center. She has been the Director of Advancement Communications at Trinity College, Senior Communications Officer and Senior Communications Consultant for the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Vice President of Corporate Communications for Connecticut Public Television and Radio, and many, many other things. Her work has earned her Gold and Silver Mercury Awards for the Connecticut Valley chapter of the Public Relations Society of America, 3 Emmy Awards, and a First Place Award for Excellence in Journalism from the Society for Professional Journalists. So thank you, everybody, very much for being here, and enjoy the show.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Wow, love that sound. So I'm just going to ask you all to introduce yourselves. I'll introduce you, and then just tell us a little bit about yourselves and why you're here. Start with you, Belina.
So my name is Belina Diabru, and I'm a media literacy educator, researcher, and practitioner. I've been doing this work for about 27 years, which is hard to believe. Definitely have had a lot more happening since 2016 with this discussion, because a lot of people did not know what media literacy was until that point. And I've been doing a lot of work in the area of the global look at media literacy and disinformation, as well as equity and justice. And so I've had a couple of publications in the last year in regards to that, and then working a lot with civic engagement. I teach classes at Sacred Heart University, and I've been really looking at how youth have been participating or not participating in our voting process. So it's been an interesting time.
Yeah, we're really going to talk about that. Yeah. Okay. Jared.
Thank you. Jared Ferrari. I'm currently with the Narrative Project, a really long title, so bear with me. Director of Earned Media, Senior Account Manager. We're the state's only anti-racist PR firm. We work with groups, as I just saw the ACLU walk in, CTJA, groups along those lines, Planned Parenthood. I have a background in journalism, about 20 some odd years. I was managing editor of The Hour for about 12 years, which is in Norwalk. Served as a reporter in all those Fairfield County towns along the Gold Coast, Stanford, and then jumped out about 4 years ago to communications, and I've landed myself here at the Narrative Project and enjoy it.
Not bad, Jared. Mara.
I'm Mara Sutman-Lee. I am an assistant professor of American politics at Connecticut College down the road in New London. And most recently, my work has focused on understanding how voters get their information. In early 2020, I had this little hunch that the information that election officials put out on social media might be important, perhaps, that election cycle. And I'm being a little facetious. It was very important. And I started this data collection project where I collected all of the handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for every local election official office in the United States. We searched over 6,000 jurisdictions, and we have the state jurisdictions as well, and we are replicating that effort this cycle, and we're looking at all of the information that they put out there for voters. And so I think about information access for voters, both in terms of do voters have the information that they need to vote? And is that information being clouded by misinformation, which I think will probably come up in our conversation today.
All right, yeah, it will. Yeah. Thank you. Christine.
Yeah, so I'm Christine Stewart. I am the editor-in-chief of ctnewsjunkie.com, and I have been a working reporter in the state of Connecticut for 23 years, and I bought CT News Junkie in 2006. I call it the year of the blog. That was the first year that Lamont ran against Lieberman. And social media really began to take off and really be important. So I've been in it and following it since the very start.
Okay, thank you very much. Jared and I were talking earlier about the good old days. I don't know if these are the golden years or the golden age of media, or maybe those golden years were way back then. But how has it changed from, Jared, say, maybe 20 years from ago?
It's changed tremendously. I mean, we were talking also earlier, staff sizes in newsrooms have decreased. Obviously, it's fully online now. You mentioned 2006. That was a tremendous year because that was the first year Twitter came into existence. I think the first time I used it in a newsroom was 2007, and the reporters were out in the field at all the registered voters' offices on their cell phone, and they had to text in, and then we had an API on the website that would. So from there, it's just changed dramatically. Staff's reduced, shifted focus, ad revenue went down. I'm talking from a print perspective because I'm old and that's how I look at the media. So excuse me if I do that. But yeah, I mean, tremendous changes.
And so it has been a change. How have we, the media, risen to that occasion? How have we changed to accommodate how we give information out and how people take information in?
Right. I think, well, there's obviously fewer of us to hold people accountable, and I think that there is a lot of individuals putting information out there on social media, and there's not enough of us to research and challenge it. You know, usually there's a little germ of truth in something that somebody tweets out, but you're constantly having to, you know, as an additional part of your job, make sure that the correct information is out there and not misinformation. And a lot of it then becomes based on your reputation and you know, whether people trust you. And I think a lot of this then relates back to 2016 when conservatives felt that they weren't included in the polling data.
Right.
And I think that, you know, maybe, you know, the pollsters got it wrong because of that. And so there's a growing mistrust of the media also.
If I may,
Yes,
to add to that, Gallup just came out with a poll that really said that this is the worst, probably the second worst time where people have trust in the media. And that really speaks to what is happening right now in terms of how people are getting their information and wanting to communicate. In fact, I would say the news desert problem has enhanced the issue and not retracted from it. And I know several years ago, Facebook Meta wanted to jump into that bandwagon, which I always found kind of concerning anyway for various other reasons that we could talk about, but to sort of extend where we are getting information and newspapers and broadcasting, and that has not necessarily happened. In fact, the opposite, where we see many more places closing up shop and saying, no, we're not going to do this. And then even to go online, the assumption also would be who the person is who's reading that information. And I think if we're talking about youth, we need to really step away from the way we conceive traditional media, because that's not how they're actually getting their information any longer.
So the horse is already out of the barn.
Yeah,
That. And
100%.
Your job is to educate. We talked about media literacy.
Sure.
Educate young people
Yes.
how to discern.
Yes, I love that word actually.
Okay.
Because I think that's a deeper word than fact checking.
Okay.
And I know that there's a lot of organizations that I admire and I respect that do a lot of fact checking protocols that they give to educators and so forth. But I feel like that's so peripheral, and discernment requires that you actually think about the information that you're receiving. Because you can fact check something and it still will be kind of true, talking about that germ of truth.
Right.
But discernment requires that you look deeper and find more information and actually spend the time to locate that information. And that's a harder task to teach.
Well, and teaching them how many authoritative source, what's an authoritative source? How many
Right.
authoritative sources do you see
Right.
in this story? And, how much the thing I love about being online and being able to publish online is I can actually give people access to the primary source of information.
Right.
So if you don't believe what I'm saying or how I've written it up or how I've paraphrased it, here's the document.
Understanding primary source, secondary source, that kind of thing. Mara, you talked about data and the work that you've been doing, the research you've been doing. What have you found out? What have you learned?
In terms of the social media data from election officials, it's been actually quite hopeful, although on a small scale. So I want to temper expectations. My colleague, Leah Merbaki, who is at Mississippi State University, we have been trying to understand whether we call it an information ecosystem, and maybe we can challenge that or develop another way to put it, but whether the information ecosystem put out by election officials about the electoral process in particular, whether this is both helping voters, is it helping them register, is it helping them check everything correctly, make sure a ballot doesn't get rejected, sort of the actual mechanics of voting.
Right.
But then, of course, is it also addressing issues related to misinformation, like I said? And we have some research right now that's under review that shows that in states where the state election official is very active, maybe they're getting lots of earned media, maybe they're doing a lot of outreach events, investing a lot of money in communicating with voters, that voters' perception of fairness in ballot counting is higher in those states. And that's even true for voters who cast a ballot for President Trump in 2020. It's not as high, they're still lower, but if you're comparing those voters to voters in other states where the election official isn't as active, you see lower confidence in ballot counting. And confidence in ballot counting is one of the primary ways in which we think about measuring and understanding confidence in the electoral process. So like I said, there's some tepid hope, I think, that my work has to offer. And I think at the same time, I think about the question of this information environment that we're currently in for election officials with a lot of fear, because a lot of their voices as experts get drowned out by misinformation, by people who think that they know more about the electoral process than they do, and when in fact your local and state election officials are your trusted sources of information. So it's an uphill battle, but there's some encouraging things that we're finding.
That's where the fourth state comes in. You need a journalist in those rooms at all times when the votes are being counted, because you need that outside trusted source. And to our comments before about staffing, you don't have the ability to have multiple reporters in every town in Connecticut. We're lucky in Connecticut to have like the News Junkie, the Mirror, because on a state level, we have high-level reporting that's still being done. They made the transition. That's the small towns around that kind of add up to the greater the greater some that don't have that. We're starting to come around in Connecticut a little bit, but we're about 10 to 15 years behind, but we're still ahead of a lot of other people. I know in Monroe, there's a former colleague that just started an online paper. And there's ones like that popping up, but the old traditional media missed the ball in making that transition smooth. I think we're still counting some dollars and didn't do it. So the horse can be put back in the barn a
Right.
little
Well,
bit.
I mean, even with the election day ballot counting, so the Associated Press does hire people for, I think it's $75 is the pay to go to each of the polling places so that they have results, because election officials are not reporting results to their new online electronic, monitoring system with enough time for it to be newsworthy. Obviously, there's always the after the fact, but Connecticut has always done an awful terrible job of reporting election results.
I've kept reporters in City Hall until 3 or 4 in the morning
3,
and
4 in the
still
morning,
not gotten
yeah,
results.
until they get the actual sign
Yeah.
off from the registrar. Yeah.
But may I ask, this is actually where I think civic engagement is incredibly important, because some of this would be alleviated if we had community involvement in this process to the extent where people felt comfortable. I think one of the things that happens is that someone who's outside of the community comes and there's a distrust factor already in play. And so that adds to the problem of how people feel about their vote. Is it actually getting counted? Who's deciding? And then the outcome of that is when someone's walking out and talking to a polling person, it's a stranger. Well, I'm going to say whatever I want to say, not necessarily what I actually did. And I think that in part is also what contributed to 2016, because as polls were coming out and people and the things that were being said, there was a little piece of me just watching my own community that I knew that could not possibly be true. So it was fascinating to watch the dynamic.
Boy, we got it really wrong.
We got it
We
really wrong.
really got it wrong. So let me talk about two different things. You mentioned community involvement.
Right.
And educating media literacy. When do we start educating people, young people, about media literacy?
Well, if it's me, I have to be honest with you. If you're going to have a child, I think it should be part of prenatal classes. I am not kidding.
Seriously.
And I'm being very honest about
my
it.
daughter. It was for my daughter.
And the reason why I say that is because what happens is that as a parent, you're using now the technology as a babysitter. And that starts, I'm sure you've all been in trains and planes and everything else, and here's a parent with a cell phone in front of a child or an iPad, and there's not a lot of thinking going behind, like what's actually happening, where's the child clicking and going, and maybe they don't understand necessarily what's there, but that evolves to them being in school eventually.
Right.
And so that keeps continuing, and so the need for thoughtful understanding of how media affects us, the time, certainly in the last few years with COVID, we really have to address screen time a little bit more because it's changed things. But yeah, for me, I would say prenatal.
I have thoughts on this from the college student perspective, and I've been teaching, this is the start of my 6th year of teaching, and I was a teaching assistant in graduate school, and I have seen, and this is a hypothesis, I'll put that out there as a researcher, a good careful researcher that deserves some testing, but I have observed an increase in a deep skepticism that my students have of traditional media, of scholarly articles. And it's not, I will assign things that are complex and I'll walk them through and, well, I'm not sure I buy this finding. I'm like, well, here's what they did. And it's almost like there's nothing that I can do to gently open up their perspectives if a finding doesn't comport with something that they previously held. And that's not happening all the time, but it does happen, and I feel like I've seen an uptick. And so I would love to see more media literacy and just, I think, scholarly literacy of how do you discern and understand probability and statistics. And I was having this conversation with my students yesterday, probabilities are tricky things to communicate, and that's why we get outcomes like 2016 and misunderstandings among a lot of folks. So I've seen a big shift in my students over time.
Skepticism and discernment.
Yes.
Okay, you talked about your 13-year-old, right?
Yeah, I was trying to wait, but yeah, it's funny. I worry more about my mother with online news because she can fall victim to the Facebook post. My 13-year-old doesn't believe anything he sees online anymore. Just kind of, not in a negative way, but like I know it's all kind of could be questionable, so I'll stay away. So it's weird to see that kind of dichotomy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, again, start as early as possible. I know my kids have heard it from me, probably don't want to, but we talk about politics, and civics is so missing in schools. It's
Yeah.
Well, I've seen an increase just in this election cycle, just within the past few months, of people not being able to discern what an opinion column is from what reporting is.
Right.
Yeah.
And having to explain the difference to them on several occasions. And I will, I'll go right on social media and be back and be like, this is an opinion and this is a news story, and there are differences between the two.
Right.
So
and,
true.
And I just want to add to that. This is actually, I think, one of the main issues that we're having, which is that people can't see the difference between opinion and news, because most of our news that we watch, especially in our 24-hour cycle news, happens to be opinion. And within that time frame, you get a small section of actual news, but then you end up going into and watching a newscast where 5 people are sitting, each deliberating the news. So that's no longer fact as much as it is someone who's an expert in this area. And I kind of feel like somewhere along the line, Ted Koppel, I don't know if you remember who Ted Koppel was from Nightline. People who are young probably won't know who Ted Koppel is. But I remember hearing him at a talk, saying that, once we stepped into news becoming opinion pieces and not, segmented to the opinion section of a newspaper, but it's actually as part of the news, we've lost people's trust. And I think that really says something about what's missing, which is that trust factor.
So is it time for a junior Connecticut news junkie, junior junkie online?
Yeah, well, my 7-year-old wants nothing to do with the news. Refused to be interviewed on the first day of school. She was like, no, I don't want to be in the local paper.
We do
So
have
I
to
think
start.
that there is, even at the smallest grade levels, there's a need for it, but there is a skepticism.
Yeah.
Okay. So the state of Connecticut has hired a cybersecurity analyst. Did you know that? To combat misinformation before it goes viral. You think this is helpful?
It's going to
So
be.
this is the second year that they've done this.
Oh, wow.
So they did have one last year. This person has moved on. It's funded with some federal grant dollars. And so they recently onboarded this gentleman at the end of September. And so, his job is to fight against the misinformation of where your polling place is, or that, a bag of ballots was found on the side of the road, the things that create distrust and make people have greater apathy and not go out to the polls. And so that's his job. There's concerns, obviously, from some certain politicians that, the job would be to take down posts of a partisan opponent, but that is not the job of this person. So there hasn't been anything, I don't know if there has been anything grandiose discovered or anything like that, but there is, with Connecticut right now, the absentee ballot process, and you have to get an absentee ballot application in order to apply for the absentee ballot, and now that can be done online, and so there's a little bit of mistrust, and the campaigns are pulling out absentee ballots, so people are receiving maybe 2 or 3 absentee ballots, and they don't know if they've, they're returning the right one, or why this ballot is even showing up at their house. So,
Very interesting. So what do we do about it? We talked about we really need to teach young people. What about people our age? You're worried about your mom. Okay, you're worried about your mom. Okay, we know what we need to do with young people, but then what do we do with people who've already formed those opinions and are going down a path that is distrustful or scary even?
Right.
Well, there is not an easy answer to this question, and I don't mean to be so pessimistic. We were talking about this earlier before we started, how changing minds, opening, I like to think about it as like opening minds, because it's not that you are going to be able to get into someone's brain and flip their thinking, but I talk to my students about it like you're creating the conditions for a new perspective. And to do that, the person you're talking with has to feel understood and has to feel, it's as simple as that. And this is, again, my one-on-one experiences with my students. But it is on a broad scale if we're talking about interventions that would reach thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Cultivating that type of connection is much more difficult. And I like to think about what you were just discussing with the cybersecurity misinformation, challenging misinformation, pairing that with so much transparency and information from official sources. I think election officials need a PR department. I feel like they need a marketing department. One of the nonprofits I work with, their tagline is literally "Democracy needs a marketing department," and a lot of election officials will say the same thing. And so, if we can, do the best we can to limit the pernicious misinformation, disinformation from sinking its teeth into our brains, for lack of a better way of putting it, I think that will go a long way. But yes, there are, of course, folks who I think understandably are going down these paths of believing very, very wild claims, and it's a different set of mechanisms that I think about in terms of how we actually undo that.
Well, and do you feel that it's the older demographic?
I actually don't know. I don't
Okay.
know. I think that like I said, because I see this deep skepticism among and I want to say also, healthy skepticism is a beautiful thing. That's what critical thinking is, But I see this deep skepticism among my students, and I think that it's just a different sort of brand of going down the quote unquote wrong path, where younger folks seem to be just skeptical of everything. And, perhaps it's more likely that an older demographic would fall into more conspiratorial thinking about elections and things like that. So, that's not survey data I have off the top of my head, but I think it's a reasonable expectation.
And I might argue against that as well, because I know that Pew puts out the data about our elderly citizens and them getting more misinformation, and yet I find that I speak to more of our older population, and because they do actually invest the time to read and look and listen to the media, that's not necessarily the case. I think it's a little off balance to think that it's one versus the other. I actually think everybody needs a little bit of literacy help, and I would say certainly media literacy, because I believe it doesn't matter where you're at. There's always going to be a new technology tool, a new way to get to someone. And that's going to require that you actually have some thinking behind it. And I'll also note, I know you mentioned Twitter earlier, and just a little fun fact about Twitter. The reason why Twitter took off was because of the plane that landed on the Hudson. Because there were people who were there tweeting about it, but news wasn't using it.
I used that photo.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So, but it had been used in the Arab Spring. It had been used by people in war, and still used in Ukraine, certainly when the war is going on. It's been used in really amazing ways. The problem is that we don't have any guidelines. There aren't any laws about the way in which social media is out there. There's an attempt being made, we're going to fact check this, we're going to do this, but they're companies that have been kind of allowed to do whatever they want to do for a very long time. Right. And so what's the next thing? And for me, I think it's looking at the algorithm, which is actually kind of concerning to think that the cyber security person won't necessarily be looking at that, which I actually think is the most important thing.
Well, and they change it every day, so how do you keep up?
Right.
So it's like, it's difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
I still go to Twitter for my election results. I mean, it's the first place I check to get those people that are actually at the polling places and get the numbers. I think in general, it's a detachment, whether you're young or old. And to your point before about opinion pieces, just that education around what's opinion and what's news. I have an aunt that watches MSNBC all day and is convinced that's the news. And I know people that watch Fox News all day. And that's analysis all day. It's just opinion, and they don't see that as anything but that. So good news sources in front of people, and again, I keep going back to it, but starting at a local level, so you reduce that sense of detachment from community and what's happening on your local boards and commissions. It's really important, and when people see it face to face and the consequences of some of these decisions. I mean, we don't want to bring January 6th up into it, but you saw those people when they got into court later on being like, wow, I didn't realize this was that that's serious.
Jared, talk a little bit about why local is so important. We start with, all news is local, right? But why is it so important?
I used to say when I was young, investigative journalism, that's what I want to do. We're going to be really hard hitting. I think when I first took over a paper, it's like, we're going to go get them. Then I got in there and I realized, the first call was like, why isn't the pasta supper on page 3? Why wasn't this? And I was like, man, this is really important to people and how their community operates on it. When their trash is going to be picked up, I'm like, okay, if we do all that well, then we could go do the investigative pieces. So you need that foundation, like what's happening on their local boards. How are my taxes going to go up and down? How is this school being broken apart and kids being sent here, or for what reasons? So you have to start with that, and then you could kind of dig deeper if you have the staff to do it.
Right. There's no such thing as investigative reporting as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
I think the local reporter who is on the beat every day is going to see what they need to see to be able to do the story. And then what happens, because I worked for them, the New York Times comes in and they swoop in and they just parachute in and they pretty much redo the story and just make it into more of a national one.
No, that's a little scary. So let me talk about disinformation and inoculation against misinformation. I explained to you all before, I am a member of the Public Relations Society of America. We have a website called Voices for Everyone, and we talk in depth about disinformation. And one of the research little pods they have talks about inoculating people against misinformation and disinformation. Is that possible?
Do you want to start with the positive piece and my concern?
Sure, yes. So I think that it is possible, but we have to have caveats about what we mean by possible in terms of what the impacts are. So I have some pretty compelling research that shows that a Trump voter in a state with an election official who is very active in educating voters, they're going to have more confidence in ballot counting than their counterpart, Trump voter in another state. But that doesn't mean they're going to be as high as the average voter. Like, it's not going to close the gap. And so I think that we have to think much more complex than just putting a lot of information out there when we're talking about I think about it as like there's a confidence gap. We have, we know that folks who select losing candidates in elections, they're just generally less likely to have confidence because maybe something was wrong. Like, how could I have selected a losing candidate? If folks have bad experiences at polling places, they're also, oh man, it doesn't seem like my ballot was counted or my mail ballot was rejected. They're also less likely. So there's all of these things that we can address that don't necessarily deal with mis and disinformation, but that can boost, I think, voters' immunity, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. But no, it's not that there is a catch-all or a cure-all, but I think about it as very much it's easier to prevent that from taking hold. It's still challenging than it is to change minds, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
So I guess for me that it comes down to words matter. And when you use a word like inoculation, it sounds like a one-time shot. And this is a lifelong skill. When I'm talking about media literacy education, and this is why I say it should be at birth, it's really about a lifelong skill. If we want people to think deeply, to discern, it's the questions that you have to ask every day. Who constructed the message? Why is this out there? Who's paying for it? What's the profit behind it? And it doesn't just come down to just what's happening with the election. It's about everything around us. The advertisements that we see. Right. Why did you choose to buy what you chose to buy? Why you're buying a house, information in general, all of it. And I find the word inoculation ends up also now getting associated with COVID.
Yeah.
Which is another negative to add into it that really, I think, is a turnoff for people to think about where media literacy education, is it important, or is it just another political thing, which is really problematic if we really want to teach people about skills and discernment.
Okay.
I don't disagree. No, that's a really important point about, there's a bit of, I don't know if I would call it misinformation, but there's a bit of a misleading idea behind this challenging misinformation as it's a one-time shot, because no, you do want it to be like this repeated. You want it to be an ecosystem that is cultivated and
Yes.
developed over years.
Yes.
So yeah, when you live in a place where your elected officials are very active in communicating, that's not a one-time thing. That's consistently happening every election cycle. So.
And I'll say for my current field now, communications, I mean, not everybody operates, not to plug my own firm, the Narrative Project, is this necessary is one of the first things we ask ourselves when we do things. Are we being transparent? We had a poll that came out from one of our partners, and we'll say who, the other day, they're like, how do we appear in this? They paid for the poll. I'm like, say you funded the poll. It's that easy. Not every comms firm is necessarily doing that because their job is to serve the client.
Right.
So yeah, there is disinformation that needs to be, maybe not directly, but it's clouded a little bit. So the more people are educated about what they're reading, the better.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know
Prenatal.
how we're doing on time, but I do have a question about how is Connecticut doing? I mean, I will be so happy when November 8th comes because all I see are the ads on TV and it's making me crazy. How are we doing with misinformation?
No, I thought it was really interesting that you just said the ads that you see on TV, because I would wonder if our young youth are actually seeing any ads.
I'm a political reporter, and I have not seen any ads because I don't watch cable news. I watch cable news streaming, but it doesn't have any advertisements that go along with it. I've seen maybe one or two on one of the streaming
YouTube,
services.
my son gets a lot on YouTube. He watches Ned Lamont and Bob all day.
On
really?
YouTube?
Oh,
Yeah.
constant.
Wow.
I mean, I know that some of them have purchased, but I guess my TV consumption is probably not as high as
I
others.
walk by the iPad or something every once in a while. See, there goes Ned. There goes Bob.
I saw Ned at the Hartford Half Marathon a couple
There you go.
weeks ago. I have seen, the one thing I've seen come up in my own feeds is the issue about early voting. That's, in terms of, and so I don't know if that's being exposed to, our students are on TikTok more.
There is a
and
campaign
There's a
behind
campaign
it.
that's
So
happening, yeah.
I don't use TikTok, and I don't really want to.
Right, yeah, I'm a little.
Seems like, so I don't know how much is actually happening on there. It hasn't made the news cycle. So
Yeah, no. It's just something I was like, why am I seeing this on my Instagram? It was very surprised to see it there. But I haven't seen any other candidate ads or anything like that.
Do a panel with our children next week.
my
I know. Well, I will tell you, unofficially, when I polled my college students, they aren't very much interested at the midterms.
Wow.
So I think that really is interesting. And
Yeah.
but a year ago or 2 years ago now, wow, first time ever, almost every student sat in my class said they voted, which was amazing to me.
Okay.
But over the course of time, and I think this really is something about this idea of apathy. The New York Times just had a piece about apathy. And, will people actually come out to vote if they're just so disengaged and they distrust everything and they distrust the system that's in place for voting? And that's hugely problematic because that's about a democracy now. And I really think we really need to work on that piece. And I think that brings it back to what Jared said is we need civics classes to really step up the game young.
Well, so what I find disappointing is, so every year we have a voter guide, and we ask 10 questions. Obviously, we're a newspaper, so we're not partisan. We're not supporting anything. We're not, the NRA or Planned Parenthood or anything. So a lot of candidates fill out these surveys for the organizations to get their endorsement. This is just a straight up survey to let people know where they stand. And participation in that by the candidates is down like 75%. Which is super disappointing. And so I spoke to people about it. I was like, why aren't you participating, or why did you participate? And the people who aren't participating think that they can reach voters in other ways on their own, through social media, through door knocking. But I was like, this is a one-stop shop where you can use it and then you can share it on social and say, hey, I endorse this person. So it's been a little bit of a
Campaign policy,
disappointing.
right?
It's been right, exactly.
To not fill out surveys. That's our campaign policy. Don't fill out surveys.
No, I mean, it's like, oh, I delegated that to my staffer to do. Oh, I delegated that to somebody else to do. And
So it's not important to them.
It's not important to them.
So, you jumped into my next question about disengaging from consuming the news, and how is that going to affect our society, our democracy going forward?
I think that's a really important question to ask because we're already there.
Yeah.
And it's really concerning when something really important is happening and we need people to vote and people choose not to. So for me, I think this is where it's really important to talk about things at the community level. You know, honestly, the politician who door knocks, I think, has a better chance at this point right now because he's vested in his community than someone who someone sees on a platform but never really actually gets to feel connected to because they're only getting them through media. So it's a real, I think it's going to be a really interesting time that we're in from this election forward about where it is that our candidates are going to be. That's mine.
I haven't even gotten any mailers this year, which is, direct mail. It's usually like you're throwing them in the recycling bin constantly. But I think the problem this year is that even with the door knocking, I think there's such a partisan divide at the moment that even if they know Connecticut is known for ticket splitting. It does ticket splitting all the time. If you know your local state rep, you're going to vote for them whether, you're a Democrat or Republican, you're going to vote for them because you know them. They're your neighbors. You know that they have your best intentions in mind. But I don't think that's going to happen this year. I think people are going to vote straight party.
Really?
I also think, and I'm sorry, I hope I'm apologize for jumping in here, but my worry really is that we don't listen to people. We don't really listen to people's concern. On a national level, if you look at the news in the last 2 years, there's 3 stories that have kind of taken over. And the most recent one was the Queen, I'll be honest, that took over and bumped everything out. The Ukraine, the stuff that's happening in Ukraine, and January 6th. There is a whole big country with a lot of issues, and we don't see them represented in our media. Right. And this kind of brings us back to that first question about, do we see the news where we need it to be? It has in part to do with news deserts, but the other issue is, right after 2016, the New York Times did this map of where media is in the country. And most of our media is segregated to the East Coast and the West Coast. It does not filter into the middle of the country. So how can you represent a whole entire country if you're not even participating in the concerns of the people who live in those spaces? So, the chances of us having a surprise election isn't so surprising if the media is never looking in that direction.
I mean, I don't want to be Debbie Downer. We talked about the horse being out of the barn, way, way, way out of the barn. Right. Can we come back?
I mean, I think that what you said about listening just really raised my antennas in some hopeful ways, but the process of coming back is not going to happen overnight.
Right.
I think about how, as an elections expert, I get approached by friends and family and, who have legitimate questions like, hey, I saw this in a box of absentee or whatever it is, Right. And usually the first thing I say to them is, thank you so much for coming to me. Looking at what you've shared with me, it's so clear to me why you've arrived at that conclusion. I understand.
Right.
You're incorrect, and I don't necessarily follow with that, but and in terms of coming out of or coming back from this, it's those types of community level, grassroots level conversations. My impact extends to the folks in this room, people who are watching, my classroom, understanding what your network of impact is so important because otherwise it is very easy to get lost in a sea of hopelessness and just completely disengage. But listening and, as myself as an educator, creating a space of understanding and dare I say safety, that hey, it's okay that you made a mistake, that you misinterpreted this piece of election information. I'm an expert. This stuff is complicated. Let me help you walk through it. Those little things can go a long way and do have a ripple effect, but it's not going to be overnight change.
So many people don't have an expert to go to, like you, is the problem. And then they also don't have, so I think it also goes back to how we finance and fund the media and reestablish newsrooms because they have not only been decimated, we're down 26% newsroom employment since 2008. There's only about, I think the last statistic from Pew was there's only about 140,000 journalists across the country, period, to cover how many, news events that are happening. And, TV news, local TV news, their revenue model is falling apart too as everybody cuts the cord and their revenues fall off. So there's going to be even fewer people out there to cover things.
You know, we talk about in journalism that wall between church and state, the advertising and the newsroom, but that's really important because in a newsroom, a journalist's drive is to cover the whole community. Doesn't matter if they bought the paper or subscribed to the online, they cover the community and they're kept separate, that firewall between advertising. So that model does need to be fixed. It's being fixed in some ways because it's really important to have those independent journalists out there reflecting the community. I used to have a city hall reporter that said this reflect the community back upon itself. And that's crucial. That's the job of them. But as we get into more analysis, we get away from that.
Before we go to questions, if anybody has any questions, let us know. What was your vision when you started the Junkie, Connecticut News Junkie? Why?
So I didn't start it. I bought it from somebody else
okay.
who had started it. Our goal, and it's still our goal, is to be public service journalism and to serve the public in any way we can. So, you know, there was no revenue in the early years from 2006 to 2008. There was no revenue. So there's still not enough revenue to sustain, you know, a handful of reporters and contributors and columnists. So it's a struggle, but, you know, you don't go into journalism thinking you're going to get rich.
That is very true, very true. Not sure how I'm doing on time, but does anyone have a question in our audience or online? Mariana's getting that microphone.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. I'll come over to you with the mic. And if you're watching online, also remember that you can post your question in the comments section.
How are we doing on time?
10 more minutes?
Okay.
48.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask each one of you, and think about this a little bit. A big, bold move. If you could make a bold move to change this, what would it be? I mean, it could be, you know, you got $1 trillion, okay? What would it be?
See, money goes against the journal. We don't get into it for money. So you give us money, we don't know what to do with it.
We don't know what to do.
Money? What is that?
I would definitely have more media literacy educators because I do think we definitely need to have education in this area. So I would say that's one piece of it. But I also think that we need to have community newspapers again. And I think that's an important piece because the community itself is the one that it will extend from where they're at to outside to the rest of the world. And we need to start really, I'm using the wrong word, but I'm going to say harvesting it, but really growing that because it is fundamental to our society, it's fundamental to our democracy, and then the extension of that to where it can go, I think, is where do we have children who want to then be future senators or future president? Because if you ask kids right now, they're not interested in going into politics. They're not interested in going into education either, which is really sad. But it makes me ask the question too, do they want to be journalists if everything about these fields has become so negative? So I do think we need to really work on showing what the benefits are of someone who does what you do in the community and work in that way, so that they understand that the media is an extension of the community as well.
Bold,
Jared. CTN does a great job, PBS, I mean, those kind of models, NPR model, create a trust and pump money into that, I guess. Get more reporters out there and maintain that firewall that I talked about before. That's what you need.
All right, I've had a little bit more time to think. So I can say something a little bit bolder. Throw money, all of the money at local institutions, local news, and election officials. They need more funding. Everyone was up in arms in 2020 about the Zuckerberg dollars and money coming in from nonprofits. And my response to that is, you don't like nonprofits putting money to support elections, then fund elections. Support election officials report one of their number one concerns is a lack of resources. And usually the first thing to go when they don't have resources is outreach to voters. And so I think, if we could combine our ideas like universal media literacy, as much funding as election officials need to administer elections, to engage in voter education and outreach, because they are the stewards of American democracy. They are the ones who are, the election officials and poll workers are the ones who are making the machine run. And we need to value them more and support them more. Unfortunately, in this day and age, they also need literal protection, physical protection. And so that is where, if I had, endless amounts of money, I would pour a good chunk of it into supporting their work, so they feel like they are safe and able to connect with voters and build trust. That's my pie in the sky idea.
Okay.
I would say universal media literacy, or force institutions of higher learning at least to have media literacy be one of the electives that you need in order to get past that first year of college. I mean, I would start as young as grade school, but I think as far as a good place to start is making sure that it's available in colleges.
Election officials, we talked a little bit about this, Jared, about those people who get involved at that level often move up and maybe run for offices and things like that. So how do can we not affect that so much, but how do we make sure that those people are educated and can discern between, and don't take sides when it comes to being an election official, and then they move on or up to something
Well, Connecticut's
more about?
weird and everything. They're weird in this too, where they have like one from each political party, sometimes a third party. They're also register of voters offices are very underfunded. I mean, they do work
And they're also
hard.
elected
They're also elected.
themselves.
And we don't think that that's important, though. On the local level, we don't.
Yeah, you have
Nobody
to
really
even
talks
know who
about
it
that.
is.
No.
They're not trained in
No.
vote counting for the most part, but they're ongoing training, ongoing education is very important in those roles.
So maybe we need to focus on that a little bit.
Well, because there's little money. I mean, you look at we have per year, it's about a $42 billion budget for the state of Connecticut. The Secretary of State's office gets $20 million. I mean, at most for its entire office and all of the staff that it funds. And then some of that money then trickles down to cities and towns, but there's not a lot of money there.
Does anybody have any questions here in the audience?
We do have a question.
Yeah. So you guys briefly touched on talking about social media and how they're relatively allowed to do whatever they want. And so I was curious what you guys think regulation or limitations on social media could look like in the future or should look like in the future?
Really good question.
That is a good question.
Yeah.
Well, there's a little known secret that there's actually one little regulation that in place, although I don't really understand how it's functioning, but it's called the right to be forgotten, which is something that the EU has done a lot of work with. So interesting, if we look at this globally, what happens in other countries with social media is much more enforced. There's many more laws in place than here in the United States. We literally have none. You would think after the whistleblower from Facebook, we would have had all these new things thrown out, and we really have not. But there is one little glimpse, and it is this idea that you can ask for whatever yourself is that's online, your digital footprint, to be removed, which I think would be really important for youth. Especially because we all know, I mean, I grew up without these digital technologies. We all make mistakes. Things get out there. But there was no way of actually removing it. And I would watch my college students try to purge pictures and images and anything that they could at the end of graduation, especially if they were trying to get a job at a law firm or a specific type of job that needed them to not have that. So it's unknown because it was only covered once. It was a blip. So I don't even know the extent of what we actually have here. I do think we need to have more oversight and so the internet, when it came out, was supposed to be this amazing thing, right?
Right, yeah.
You know, we loved it because it was this first place where you could go and you could say whatever you want and do whatever you want. And I don't think anybody thought about consequences. And I still think it should be that to a certain extent. But I do think that there should be some personal rights that individuals have within that space so that you can at least reclaim your life. You know, and that's my, I don't know if anybody has any other.
I love the right to be forgotten.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other
Yeah,
thoughts?
I don't know about regulation. I mean, you got to kind of hope they phase themselves out. Twitter had such great potential in the beginning, that 2006, 2007, up until whatever it was, and then it became a vacuum of journalists talking to each other, and then it just became
A vacuum.
junk. Yeah. Yeah. And the other, I mean, you have to let them phase it. I don't know if regulation will help it, because people just find something to poke holes in it. Just got to create better products. I mean, I do believe in technology advancing and making us better, but I don't know if regulation helps.
Yeah, I think given you know, the legal system in the United States, regulation that would be helpful is not likely. And so I try to think about proactive things that can be done. I think that something that I've just, you know, heard among my students is they are starting to think a little bit more about some of their social media circles is like, this is where I go for a little bit of community and connection. And so rebranding what, God, that make me sound like rebranding. I'm not a marketing person, but like rebranding what those spaces mean. You know, and I think about my own social media presence. I don't go to social media for news. I will go to the Hartford Courant. I will go to the Junkie, the Day down in New London, and then some national news outlets. But I think that anytime you slap a regulation on something, there's going to be someone who's going to poke a hole in it, or there's going to be a backlash. And it's not that things shouldn't be regulated. It's just that we want to think about those changes relative to what human nature is. I think about the backlash to masking, where, you know, like when you're being told to do something, or when you're being told that this and that is being restricted. We also have to, you know, come at it from the bottom up and sort of a re-education of folks in a way that encourages them to sort of step out of the vicious cycle of, you know, being in their own bubble on social media, and seeing the same things posted and, you know, not really stepping outside of themselves when it comes to the news that they're consuming.
I think as far as regulation is concerned, I don't think it's possible to regulate these entities based on the current state of our government and the organizations that we have set up as watchdog organizations. The Consumer Finance Bureau was just found unconstitutional for the way it's funded. So, you know, I have no faith that they'd be able to take on any of this.
Funded through the Treasury, right?
Right, funded through the Treasury and not the Congress.
I thought I was a Debbie Downer. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all so very much. This has been a stimulating, interesting conversation. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. Thank you, Belina. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Mara. And thank you, Christine, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thank you, Anita, for wonderful moderating, and thank you, everybody, for coming down, if you're here in person or also if you're watching online. I hope you enjoyed today's program. I do invite you to come back next week for the third and final panel discussion in our Untangling the Tally series. Next week is going to be all about the barriers to voting. It's going to be moderated by Val Ramos from the Everyday Democracy, and we have also another great panel of experts to talk about the barriers to voting. Before you head out, we do have an election cake bake-off event coming up in November the 5th. That's a Saturday. It's going to be right here. You'll get to see a bunch of really cool cakes. They're going to be judged, and we're going to crown a winner. You're very welcome to come to that event. It's going to be really, really fun. That's the 5th of November. And I hope you enjoyed today's program and have a wonderful rest of your day.